The year was 1887, and the Montana Territory stretched endlessly under a sky so vast it seemed to swallow men whole. Samuel McKenna had been alone on his ranch for 3 years, ever since consumption took his first wife, leaving him with nothing but cattle, endless prairie, and a silence so deep it echoed in his bones. The nearest neighbor lived 20 miles east, and the town of Copper Falls was a hard day's ride through unforgiving terrain. In this land where winter could kill a man and summer could drive him mad with loneliness, Samuel had made a decision that would change everything. Hey there, friend. Before we dive deeper into Samuel's story, I'd love for you to hit that subscribe button if you're enjoying this tale from the Old West. And tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from? I love hearing from folks all across the country who appreciate a good story. Samuel had placed an advertisement in the Chicago Tribune seeking a mail-order bride. The response came from Miss Eleanor Whitmore, a 23-year-old woman whose letter spoke of refinement, education, and a desire to start fresh in the frontier. Her photograph showed delicate features, dark hair pinned neatly, and eyes that seemed to hold secrets. When she stepped off the stagecoach in Copper Falls on that crisp October morning, Samuel felt his heart stir for the first time in years. Eleanor was everything her letters had promised and more. She moved with grace uncommon in these rough lands. Her voice carried the soft cadence of Eastern education, and her smile could warm a room faster than any fireplace. She wore a traveling dress of deep blue wool, modest yet elegant, and carried herself with the poise of a woman who had known better circumstances. Samuel found himself tongue-tied in her presence, this refined lady who had chosen to share his simple life. The wedding ceremony was held 3 days later in the small wooden church of Copper Falls. With only the preacher, his wife, and 2 witnesses from town, Eleanor wore a simple white dress she had brought from Chicago, and Samuel had never seen anything more beautiful. As they exchanged vows, her hand trembled slightly in his, and he attributed it to nervousness. After all, she was marrying a stranger and committing to a life far from everything she had known. The ride back to the ranch was filled with gentle conversation. Eleanor asked about the land, the cattle, the harsh winters that lay ahead. Samuel found himself opening up in ways he hadn't in years, describing the beauty of sunrise over the mountains, the satisfaction of honest work, the peace that came with living close to the earth. Eleanor listened with genuine interest, occasionally touching his arm or offering a soft laugh that made his chest tighten with hope. Their first evening together was everything Samuel had dreamed. Eleanor prepared a simple but delicious meal from the supplies they had brought from town, moving around his kitchen as if she had always belonged there. She had brought books from Chicago, and after dinner, she read aloud by lamplight while Samuel worked on mending harnesses. Her voice was melodic, cultured, bringing stories of distant places into their humble home. When bedtime came, she kissed his cheek gently and retired to the bedroom they would share, leaving Samuel feeling like the luckiest man in the territory. But that first night, Samuel's dreams of marital bliss were shattered by sounds that would haunt him for the rest of his days. Around midnight, Eleanor's screams pierced the darkness like a knife through silk. Not the screams of physical pain, but something far more disturbing, the anguished cries of a soul in torment. Samuel bolted upright, his heart hammering against his ribs, and turned to find his new bride sitting up in bed, her eyes wide open, but seeing nothing of the present world. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," she cried out, her voice raw and desperate. "He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters." The words of the 23rd Psalm poured from her lips between sobs and screams, as if she were fighting an invisible battle for her very soul. Her hands clawed at the air, and her body shook with a violence that seemed to come from somewhere deep within. Samuel reached for her, calling her name, but she didn't respond to his touch or voice. She continued reciting psalms, switching between the 23rd and the 91st, her voice rising and falling in a rhythm that spoke of practiced desperation. "He that dwelleth in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty," she screamed, and then dissolved into sobs that seemed to come from the very depths of her being. For nearly an hour, Samuel sat helplessly beside his bride, watching her battle demons he couldn't see or understand. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the episode ended. Eleanor's breathing slowed, her body relaxed, and she lay back down, pulling the covers up to her chin. Her eyes closed, and she slept peacefully for the remainder of the night, leaving Samuel staring at the ceiling, wondering what kind of woman he had married and what darkness she carried within her. The next morning brought no acknowledgement of the night's terrors. Eleanor woke with a smile, prepared breakfast with the same grace she had shown the evening before, and went about her daily tasks as if nothing had happened. When Samuel gently asked if she had slept well, she looked at him with genuine confusion and assured him she had rested beautifully. There was no deception in her eyes, no hint that she remembered the screaming, the psalms, or the battle she had fought in her sleep. Samuel began to wonder if he had dreamed the entire episode, but the memory was too vivid, too real. He had heard every word of those psalms, seen every expression of terror on her face, felt the bed shake with her trembling. As the day progressed and Eleanor continued to be the perfect wife, cooking, cleaning, tending to small repairs around the house with surprising skill, Samuel almost convinced himself it had been a nightmare brought on by wedding nerves and too much whiskey at the celebration. But the second night brought the same horror, and the third, and every night thereafter. Always around midnight, always the same psalms, always the same desperate battle against unseen forces. Eleanor would sit up in bed, her eyes open but vacant, and recite scripture with the fervor of someone fighting for salvation itself. Sometimes she would add other verses, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil," and sometimes she would simply scream wordlessly before returning to the familiar comfort of the 23rd Psalm. Samuel tried everything he could think of. He stayed awake to watch for signs of the approaching episode, hoping to wake her before it began, but nothing he did could reach her once the screaming started. He consulted the few books he owned, looking for any explanation for such behavior, but found nothing that matched what he witnessed nightly. The nearest doctor was in Copper Falls, and Samuel couldn't bring himself to discuss such intimate and disturbing details with a stranger, especially when Eleanor herself seemed unaware of her condition. During the day, Eleanor was everything a man could want in a wife. She was intelligent, kind, hard-working, and genuinely seemed to love their life together. She learned to milk the cows, helped with the chickens, and even assisted Samuel with some of the lighter ranch work. Her laughter filled the house, and her presence transformed the lonely cabin into a real home. She spoke of their future together, of children they might have, of improvements they could make to the ranch. In the daylight hours, Samuel fell more in love with her each day, but the nights belonged to something else entirely. As the sun set each evening, Samuel felt a familiar dread settle in his stomach. He would watch Eleanor prepare for bed, brush her long dark hair, and say her normal prayers, quiet, peaceful words of gratitude for their life together. Then she would kiss him good night and settle into sleep like any normal woman. And Samuel would lie awake, waiting for midnight and the transformation that would turn his gentle wife into something he didn't recognize. The screaming psalms became the soundtrack of Samuel's existence. He learned every word by heart, could anticipate when she would switch from one verse to another, knew exactly how long each episode would last. He began to see the toll it was taking on Eleanor during the day, dark circles under her eyes despite her claims of restful sleep, a slight tremor in her hands that grew more pronounced as the weeks passed, and moments when she would stop mid-sentence and stare into the distance as if listening to something only she could hear. Samuel's own health began to suffer from the nightly vigils. He was exhausted during the day, making mistakes with the cattle and the ranch work that could have been dangerous. His neighbors, when he encountered them in town, commented on his haggard appearance and asked if everything was well at home. Samuel found himself making excuses, claiming that the adjustment to married life was taking some getting used to, but he could see the concern in their eyes. The isolation of the ranch, which had once been a source of peace for Samuel, now felt like a prison. There was no one to confide in, no one who might understand or offer advice. The nearest preacher was in Copper Falls, but how could Samuel explain that his wife screamed psalms in her sleep without sounding like he was either lying or losing his mind? And what if word got back to Eleanor? What if she discovered that he knew about her nightly torment? He couldn't bear the thought of causing her embarrassment or pain. As autumn deepened into winter, the episodes seemed to intensify. The screaming grew louder, more desperate, and sometimes Eleanor would speak in what sounded like different voices, sometimes the voice of a child, sometimes an old woman, sometimes something that didn't sound human at all. She began to move during the episodes, not just sitting up, but getting out of bed and walking around the room, her arms outstretched as if she were blind, all while continuing to recite psalms in that raw, desperate voice. One particularly cold November night, Eleanor's episode took a terrifying turn. Instead of sitting up in bed, she stood and walked to the window, pressing her face against the glass and screaming psalms at the darkness outside. "He shall cover thee with his feathers, and under his wings shalt thou trust," she cried, her breath fogging the glass. "His truth shall be thy shield and buckler." Samuel watched in horror as she began clawing at the window frame, her fingernails leaving scratches in the wood, as if she were trying to escape from something inside the room. When Samuel tried to gently guide her back to bed, she turned on him with a look of such terror and fury that he stepped back in shock. For a moment, her eyes seemed to focus on him, but it wasn't Eleanor looking back. It was someone or something else entirely. "Thou shalt not be afraid for the terror by night," she screamed directly at him, and then collapsed to the floor, sobbing and continuing her recitation, in a voice so broken it barely sounded human. That night, Samuel made a decision that would change everything. He couldn't continue living this way, and more importantly, he couldn't let Eleanor continue suffering this way, even if she wasn't aware of it. Whatever was tormenting his wife in her sleep, whatever darkness she carried from her past, he was going to find a way to help her. The next morning he would ride to Copper Falls and seek answers, no matter how difficult or embarrassing the conversation might be. But as dawn broke over the Montana prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Samuel looked at his sleeping wife and felt his resolve waver. In the morning light, with her dark hair spread across the pillow and her face peaceful in genuine sleep, Eleanor looked like an angel. How could he risk destroying the happiness they had found together during the day for the sake of mysteries that belonged to the night? How could he be sure that seeking help wouldn't make everything worse? The internal battle that raged in Samuel's mind mirrored the nightly battles his wife fought in her sleep. He was caught between love and fear, between the desire to help and the terror of losing what little peace they had managed to build together. As Eleanor stirred and opened her eyes, greeting him with that same beautiful smile that had captured his heart, Samuel realized that their story was far from over, and the most difficult chapters were yet to be written. The decision Samuel made that morning would determine not just their future together, but whether love could truly conquer the darkness that lived in the space between sleeping and waking, between the woman he married and the tormented soul who screamed psalms at the Montana night. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing the ranch in snow that seemed to muffle even Eleanor's nightly screams. Samuel had made his decision. He would seek help, but not from the townspeople who might judge or gossip. Instead, he remembered old Martha Crow Feather, a Blackfoot woman who lived in a cabin near the foothills and was known throughout the territory for her knowledge of things that couldn't be explained by conventional wisdom. Martha had helped Samuel's first wife during a difficult pregnancy, and she had a reputation for understanding ailments of both body and spirit. More importantly, she was discreet and wouldn't spread gossip through Copper Falls. Samuel knew it was a risk. Eleanor might not understand his consultation with someone many considered a savage, but he was desperate for answers. The opportunity came when Eleanor mentioned wanting to visit the general store in town to purchase fabric for new curtains. Samuel offered to escort her, planning to leave her at the store while he rode out to Martha's cabin. The journey to town took most of the morning through the snow-covered trails, and Eleanor was in particularly good spirits, chatting about their plans for spring and the improvements they could make to the ranch. At the general store, Eleanor was greeted warmly by Mrs. Henderson, the storekeeper's wife, who was eager to hear about married life and show off the latest fabrics that had arrived on the last supply wagon. Samuel left Eleanor examining bolts of blue and yellow cotton, promising to return within 2 hours. The ride to Martha's cabin took him through some of the most beautiful country in the territory, but Samuel barely noticed the snow-laden pines or the way the winter sun made the landscape sparkle like diamonds. Martha Crow Feather was a woman of perhaps 60 years, with silver-streaked hair braided down her back, and eyes that seemed to see more than most people were comfortable with. She lived in a sturdy log cabin that she had built herself after her husband died, and she supported herself by serving as midwife, healer, and counselor to anyone who sought her help, regardless of their race or social standing. When Samuel explained Eleanor's condition, describing the nightly episodes in careful detail, Martha listened without interruption, her weathered hands folded in her lap. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire that crackled in her stone fireplace. "Your wife carries ghosts," Martha said finally, her voice carrying the slight accent of someone who had learned English as a second language. Not the spirits of the dead, but the ghosts of terrible things that happened to her while she lived. The Psalms are her protection, her way of fighting back against memories that come alive in her dreams. Samuel felt his heart sink. Can you help her? Can you make it stop? Martha shook her head slowly. The healing must come from within her, but first she must remember what she is fighting. The mind sometimes hides terrible things to protect itself, but they do not disappear. They become like wolves that howl in the darkness, growing stronger when they are not faced. She rose and moved to a shelf lined with various herbs and roots, selecting several small bundles. Make tea from these herbs and give it to her before sleep. It will not stop the dreams, but it may make them clearer. Help her remember what needs to be remembered. But you must be prepared. When the memories come back, they will bring great pain before they bring healing. Samuel accepted the herbs, wrapped carefully in soft leather, and paid Martha with silver coins from his pocket. As he prepared to leave, she placed a weathered hand on his arm. "Your wife chose you because she sensed safety in your heart," Martha said. "When the darkness comes fully into the light, she will need that safety more than ever. Do not let fear make you abandon her when she needs you most." The ride back to town gave Samuel time to think about Martha's words. Ghosts of terrible things. What could have happened to Eleanor in her past that would cause such torment? Her letters had mentioned wanting a fresh start, but he had assumed she meant the normal desire of a young woman to build a new life. Now he wondered what she was running from. What memories were so terrible that her mind had buried them so deep they only emerged in screaming nightmares? Eleanor was waiting for him at the general store, her arms full of packages and her face bright with excitement about her purchases. She had bought fabric for curtains, thread for mending, and a small mirror with a carved wooden frame that she thought would look perfect in their bedroom. As they loaded her purchases into the wagon, Samuel felt a pang of guilt about the herbs hidden in his coat pocket. Was he betraying her trust by seeking help without her knowledge? Or was he fulfilling his duty as her husband, to protect and care for her? The ride home was pleasant, with Eleanor chattering about her conversation with Mrs. Henderson and the other women who had been in the store. She had learned that the Johnsons' new baby was thriving, that the Millers were planning to add a room to their house, and that there would be a Christmas social at the church in a few weeks. For the first time since their marriage, Eleanor seemed truly connected to the community, and Samuel realized how isolated she must have felt on the ranch. That evening, as Eleanor prepared their usual bedtime tea, Samuel made his decision. He added a small amount of Martha's herbs to Eleanor's cup, watching as the dried leaves dissolved into the hot water. The tea smelled slightly different, earthier, with a hint of something that reminded him of sage, but Eleanor didn't seem to notice as she sipped it while reading by the fire. "This tea tastes different tonight," she commented, but not with suspicion, more with mild curiosity. "Did you get it from a different tin?" Samuel's heart raced, but he managed to keep his voice steady. "Mrs. Henderson recommended a new blend, said it might help with sleep." Eleanor smiled and took another sip. "It's quite pleasant, very soothing." As they prepared for bed, Samuel watched Eleanor carefully for any signs that the herbs were affecting her. She seemed perhaps a bit more relaxed than usual, moving more slowly as she brushed her hair and changed into her nightgown. When she kissed him goodnight, her lips lingered a moment longer than usual, and she looked into his eyes with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Samuel," she said softly, "I want you to know how happy you've made me. Whatever happens, I want you to remember that these months with you have been the most peaceful of my life." The words sent a chill through Samuel's heart. Why would she say, "whatever happens," unless some part of her knew that change was coming? He wanted to ask what she meant, but Eleanor had already settled into bed and closed her eyes. Within minutes, her breathing had deepened into sleep, and Samuel lay beside her, waiting for midnight and whatever the herbs might bring. When the episode began that night, Samuel immediately knew something was different. Instead of sitting up abruptly and beginning to scream, Eleanor's awakening was gradual. She moaned softly, turning her head from side to side as if trying to escape something in her dreams. Her hands moved restlessly over the blankets, and she began to whisper rather than scream. "Please," she whispered, her voice that of a much younger person, almost a child. "Please don't make me. I'll be good, I promise I'll be good." The words were barely audible, but they hit Samuel like physical blows. This wasn't the voice of his composed, educated wife. This was the voice of a terrified little girl. As the night progressed, the whispers became clearer, and Samuel began to piece together fragments of a story that made his blood run cold. Eleanor spoke of a man she called Uncle Thomas, though Samuel suspected he wasn't really her uncle. She spoke of being locked in a dark room, of being told that if she screamed, God would punish her. She recited psalms not as protection, but as something she had been forced to memorize, something that had been beaten into her as a child. "The Lord is my shepherd," she whispered, but now Samuel could hear the terror behind the familiar words. He said if I could recite them perfectly, he would let me out, but I could never remember them all. I was so scared. I could never remember them all. Samuel's hands clenched into fists as the full horror of Eleanor's past began to reveal itself. She had been abused as a child, tortured by someone who used religion as a weapon, who had twisted the comforting words of the Psalms into instruments of fear and control. The nightly episodes weren't random nightmares. They were her mind's way of trying to process trauma that had been too terrible for a child to understand or survive intact. As dawn approached, Eleanor's whispers faded, and she fell into what appeared to be genuine, peaceful sleep. But Samuel lay awake, staring at the ceiling and feeling a rage unlike anything he had ever experienced. Someone had hurt his wife when she was just a child, had damaged her so severely that even now, as a grown woman, she fought the same battles every night in her sleep. When Eleanor woke that morning, she looked different, not worse, but somehow clearer, as if a fog had lifted from her eyes. She moved more slowly than usual, and Samuel noticed that her hands shook slightly as she prepared breakfast. But when she looked at him, there was something new in her expression, a vulnerability that hadn't been there before, but also a kind of relief. "I had the strangest dreams last night," she said quietly, not meeting his eyes. "I dreamed about things I haven't thought about in years, things I thought I had forgotten." Samuel's heart pounded as he realized that Martha's herbs were working exactly as she had predicted. Eleanor was beginning to remember, and with those memories would come both pain and the possibility of healing. He reached across the table and took her trembling hand in his. "Whatever you dreamed about," he said gently, "whatever you remember, you're safe now. You're here with me, and nothing from your past can hurt you anymore." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time since their marriage, Samuel saw his wife not as the composed, mysterious woman who had stepped off the stagecoach, but as the wounded child she had once been, and, in some ways, still was. The real work of their marriage was just beginning, and it would require more courage than either of them had ever needed before. But as Samuel looked into Eleanor's eyes and saw the first glimmer of hope mixed with the fear, he knew that Martha Crowfeather had been right. Eleanor had chosen him because she sensed safety in his heart, and now it was time for him to prove that her instincts had been correct. The next few nights brought a cascade of memories that poured from Eleanor's sleeping mind like water from a broken dam. With each dose of Martha's herbs, the whispered confessions became clearer, more detailed and more heartbreaking. Samuel learned that Eleanor had been orphaned at age 7 when her parents died in a cholera outbreak in Chicago. She had been sent to live with her father's brother, Thomas Whitmore, a man who presented himself to the community as a devout Christian, but who used his religious authority to justify unspeakable acts. Through Eleanor's sleeping whispers, Samuel discovered that Thomas had kept Eleanor locked in a basement room for days at a time, forcing her to memorize entire chapters of the Bible before allowing her food or water. When she made mistakes, he would beat her with a leather strap while quoting scripture about the necessity of discipline. The psalms she screamed each night weren't prayers of comfort. They were the verses Thomas had forced her to recite while he hurt her, twisted words of faith that had become associated with pain and terror. "He said God was testing me," Eleanor whispered one night, her voice still that of a frightened child. "He said if I was pure enough, if I prayed hard enough, God would make the pain stop." But it never stopped. No matter how perfectly I said the words, it never stopped. Samuel had to leave the room several times during these revelations, stepping out into the cold Montana night to compose himself before returning to Eleanor's side. The rage he felt toward Thomas Whitmore was so intense it frightened him. He found himself fantasizing about traveling to Chicago and finding the man, about making him pay for what he had done to an innocent child. But he knew that revenge wouldn't heal Eleanor's wounds, and his wife needed his strength and compassion, not his anger. During the day, Eleanor was changing as well. The memories that emerged at night were beginning to surface in her waking hours, bringing with them a complex mixture of pain and relief. She would sometimes stop in the middle of a task and stare into the distance, her hand pressed to her chest as if she couldn't breathe. Other times, she would break into tears for no apparent reason, sobbing as if her heart were breaking all over again. But there were positive changes, too. Eleanor began to talk more openly about her feelings, sharing thoughts and fears she had never voiced before. She told Samuel about the constant anxiety she had lived with, the feeling that she was always waiting for something terrible to happen. She spoke about the guilt she had carried, believing that somehow she had deserved the abuse, that she had been a bad child who needed to be punished. "I thought if I could be perfect," she said one evening as they sat by the fire, "if I could be the perfect wife, the perfect woman, then maybe God would forgive me for whatever I had done wrong as a child. I thought if I never complained, never caused trouble, then maybe I could earn the right to be happy." Samuel's heart ached as he realized how much effort Eleanor had put into being the ideal wife, not out of love or natural inclination, but out of a desperate need to prove her worthiness. Every meal she had cooked, every task she had performed, every smile she had given him had been colored by her fear that if she wasn't perfect, she would be abandoned or punished again. "You don't have to earn the right to be happy," Samuel told her, pulling her close. "You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be yourself, the real Eleanor, not the one you think I want you to be." It was during the 3rd week of the herbal treatments that Eleanor's breakthrough came. Samuel woke not to screaming or whispered confessions, but to the sound of Eleanor crying, not the desperate sobs of her nightmares, but the cleansing tears of someone finally allowing themselves to grieve. She was sitting up in bed, fully awake and aware, tears streaming down her face as she looked at her hands. "I remember everything now," she said quietly. "All of it. Thomas, the basement, the things he did. But Samuel, I also remember something else. I remember the day I decided to leave Chicago. I remember writing that first letter to you, and for the first time in my life I felt hope instead of fear." Eleanor turned to face him, and in the lamplight, Samuel could see that something fundamental had changed in her expression. The constant tension that had always lurked behind her eyes was gone, replaced by a sadness that was real and honest but no longer hidden. "I chose you," she continued, "not because I was running away from something, but because I was running toward something. I saw kindness in your letter, gentleness in the way you described your life. I knew that if I could find the courage to come here, I might finally be able to heal." Samuel reached for her, and for the first time since their marriage, Eleanor came into his arms without any reservation or hidden fear. She cried against his chest while he held her, and Samuel realized that these were the first completely honest tears she had shed in his presence. Everything before had been filtered through the protective walls she had built around her memories, but now she was truly present with him, vulnerable and real. "What happens now?" Samuel asked gently. "Do you think the nightmares will stop?" Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. "I don't know," she said finally, "but I think they might change. I think instead of fighting the memories, I might be able to let them go. Martha was right. I had to remember before I could heal." Samuel started in surprise. "You know about Martha?" Eleanor smiled through her tears. "I could taste the herbs in the tea, Samuel, and I know you well enough to know you wouldn't give me something without a good reason. I figured out that you had sought help, and I'm grateful you did. I was too afraid to ask for help myself, but I needed it desperately." The honesty of the moment took Samuel's breath away. His wife had known what he was doing and had trusted him enough to let him help her, even when she didn't understand exactly what that help would entail. It was a level of faith and partnership he had never experienced before, and it made him love her more deeply than he had thought possible. That night, for the first time since their wedding, Eleanor slept peacefully through until dawn. There were no screams, no whispered confessions, no recited psalms. She slept curled against Samuel's side, her breathing deep and even, her face relaxed in genuine rest. When she woke, she looked at Samuel with clear eyes and a smile that reached all the way to her soul. "Good morning, husband," she said, and Samuel heard in those simple words a promise of new beginnings and honest love. The nightmares didn't disappear entirely, but they changed dramatically. Instead of the terrified screaming of a trapped child, Eleanor's sleep sometimes brought tears for the little girl she had been, or angry words directed at the man who had hurt her. But these episodes were shorter, less frequent, and most importantly, Eleanor remembered them when she woke. She could talk about them, process them, and gradually let them go. Spring came early to Montana that year, and with it came a transformation in Eleanor that was as dramatic as the change from winter to summer. She laughed more freely, spoke her mind more openly, and began to make plans for their future that went beyond simple survival. She wanted to plant a garden, to learn to ride horses, to maybe even start a family when she felt ready. "I spent so many years just trying to survive each day," she told Samuel one morning as they watched the sunrise paint the mountains gold. "I never let myself dream about what I actually wanted from life, but now I can dream again, and all my dreams include you." Samuel knew that their story was far from over, that healing from such deep wounds would take time and patience. There would be difficult days ahead, moments when the past would try to reclaim Eleanor's peace. But he also knew that they had something now that they hadn't had before: complete honesty, total trust, and a love that was built on truth, rather than the careful facades they had both maintained. As Eleanor leaned against his shoulder and they watched their cattle graze in the morning light, Samuel reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. He had advertised for a mail-order bride and received a woman who screamed psalms in her sleep. But in helping her face her demons, he had discovered something far more valuable than the peaceful marriage he had originally sought. He had found a partner who had chosen to trust him with her deepest pain and her most fragile hopes. The Montana Territory was still vast and sometimes lonely, but Samuel and Eleanor no longer faced it alone. They had each other, and they had the truth, and in the end, that was enough to build a life on. The woman who had arrived like a dream had indeed brought transformation to Samuel's world, but not in the way either of them had expected. Instead of the simple happiness he had imagined, he had found something far more complex and infinitely more precious, a love that had been tested by darkness and had emerged stronger than either of them had dared to hope. As the sun climbed higher in the sky and Eleanor began to plan their day together, Samuel knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as true partners. The screaming psalms had been silenced not by forgetting the past, but by finally having the courage to remember it, understand it, and choose to build something better from its ashes. Their story had begun with mystery and fear, but it would continue with hope and the kind of love that only comes when two people are brave enough to be completely honest with each other. In the vast Montana Territory, under the endless sky that had once seemed so empty, Samuel and Eleanor had found something that many people search for their entire lives, a home that existed not in any building or place, but in the safety and acceptance they had created together. The mail-order bride had indeed arrived like a dream, but the woman who remained was far more valuable than any dream could ever be. She was real, she was healing, and she was his.